I'm actually going to just read off my sheet because I find that easier, but I will do it with gusto, so hopefully it'll be interesting. So as mentioned, I'm doing my honours project, halfway through, fingers crossed, to get it done, on Australian fairy tales. And so as a part of my research that I've done, I've almost had to permanently relocate my address to the Rare Books Library at Monash. Recently, to bring a sleeping bag or something, keep me warm in the lovely air-conditioned environment, keep the books all nice and fresh. So during my research, it's actually struck me that there's been quite a keen sense of environmentalism and conservation that's come through in the stories, and quite a lot earlier than you would usually think. I thought maybe, in the wake of global warming and all these environmental concerns that we have today, or that we're more aware of today, I thought, well, maybe it's just more of a recent thing. Boy, was I wrong. About 100 years ago, in fact, even well into the end of the 1800s, we start seeing some environmental concern coming through. I thought it was rather interesting, because I wouldn't have thought that. So that's what I'm going to pretty much talk about today. So the stories that I'm sharing with you, they're written from the right Australian, European perspective. I'm not looking at any Indigenous stories, because that brings with it all sorts of politics, and I think it forms a part of the belief system, so I'm just going to focus on a particular area. And I'm working within a definition of fairy tales being short stories with some kind of magical element. And in particular, the ones I'm looking at, I think the bush becomes the magical element, because it's so different and exotic and magical, and it draws people in. It's got its own kind of special Australian branch of magic that I think it comes into the stories. So, but that's another discussion for another day. So to set the scene a bit for you in terms of how people were writing about the Australian environment, at the end of the 19th century, we can have a look at this quote from Andrew Lang. He was a Scottish anthropologist, and he says, "In Australia all was novel and, while seemingly fresh, was inestimably old. The vegetation differs from ours, the monotonous grey gum trees did not resemble our rarefied forests, but were antique, melancholy, featureless. The birds and beasts are ancient types, rough grotesques of nature, sketching as a child draws." Which, I don't know about my childhood drawings, but probably they're not as nice as some of the creatures that we do get here. So you certainly do get quite a vision of Australia being viewed as substandard compared to Europe, which is a very typical representation. And the next slide. In a similar way, but in a kind of different sort of vein, we've got writer Atha Westbury, which I thought was a woman, but it's called Frank. I had no idea. I was a bit clueless. But, so he says, "The same law of nature which guide and rule the mother country is somewhat erratic here in the Antipodes, in as much as we are all upside down, standing on our heads in fact. Therefore we are prepared for marvels." And so we start to get, again, another comparison with Europe, but we start to get an affectionate view of the environment, which does come across in the tales as well. So, moving to the next slide. A bit of an overview of what we're doing today, what we're going to chat about. The first, I'm just going to share just a few little tidbit insights that I've found. The first is that a lot of the tales are reactionary. It's in reaction to the settler population, humans destroying the environment, creating a lot of waste, things like that. And, we start to get the reaction of the flora and the fauna in the tales. And the second is about looking at representing the Australian climate and the dangers that come with living in such an extreme country. How, we need to prepare for drought and things like that. And then we'll have a bit of a chat about any conclusions. So looking at environmentalism, why the heck would they be caring about this? There are some reasons that I think I have. And have a little bit of a chat of where some of this research can take us into an emerging field of literary theory called eco-criticism. So yes, there we go. Thank you. Sorry. So, firstly, my picture's gone off a bit, but that's okay. Concerns are reactionary, humans are dangerous. So, this will be looking at the destruction of the environment, treatment of animals in captivity, and the spread of human waste. presented in these stories. So we can view the tales that explore these issues as reactionary to the settler population. So as early as 1899, Ethel Pedley's Dot and the Kangaroo, which some of you might remember, there was an animated version. I feel like I may have been too young to have seen it, which portrays
Some of us actually
how much of a child I am. Sorry?
Some of us actually remember it as a book. Yeah.
So that one was first published quite early on. But it attempted to highlight the effects that humans were having on the natural environment. So at the time, we just got federation about to happen. We would have seen an expanse of the urban environment into the natural landscape, a bit of a transformation going on with the theme of our conference today, transforming the landscape into a home for the newly settled population. And Dot's kangaroo actually gets quite fired up about this. And he says, "You humans, you are not fit for this country at all. Of course, if you have only one home in one place, you must lost it. If you made your home everywhere and anywhere, it would never be lost. Humans are no good in our bush." So he does get quite upset about what's going on. So we can see here that even as early as the late 19th century, fairy tales are being used as a vehicle to highlight environmental concern. In the story, Dot watches a group of indigenous people with spears, and it's implied that they're in the process of hunting. So interestingly here, you might think at that time that all of the blame for the destruction of the flora and fauna might be laid on the indigenous population, but actually it's not entirely the case in this story. So the kangaroo actually widens the blame for this destruction to all of humanity. It doesn't matter, you humans, you are all the same underneath, he says. They all kill kangaroos. So the story is still mildly problematic because it does represent the indigenous population in quite a negative way, which was very typical for the time. But it is good in a sense that it does widen the blame to the settler population. So it's problematic in its representation because it does assume a kind of an initial negative representation of the indigenous population, but it is good in the same vein. So it's kind of problematic, but interesting to look at because unusual for the settlers to be held to blame as well. So humans are also represented as harbingers of destruction throughout Australian fairy tales, ruining the natural environment for the native animals. So the parents of the little angler in Amy Mack's 1910 Waterside stories, they warn him not to venture far away for fear of humans, despite his protests. He's quite a little rebellious little angler. And in the same set of stories, the mother of Rolly the frog, he is warned that your two worst enemies are little boys and snakes. So Rolly thus spent nearly all his time wondering what the bush was like and whether he could tell the difference between a man and a boy. But unfortunately, in the same set of stories, they all follow different little animals, short stories. Tommy Turtle stands as a bit of an example to the rest of the characters because he's made into turtle soup. He doesn't make it. And his shell is hung out in front of a restaurant with the word "soup today" written on it. I was quite sad that he didn't make it. I got quite attached. But from the get-go, we see humans are being destructive creatures and not all the creatures make it, which is probably a little more of a realistic representation of what was going on to the animal population. So if we go to the next one. So the native flora and fauna, they have to react to the transforming urban environment. So in Ida Rental Uthwaite's iconic illustrations, so here's one of them, looking a bit stained, but that's okay, it's an old book. The Australian native environment is fairly sparse. In her illustrations, they're quite European, and it's set in the bush and you're kind of searching for it in the illustrations. I mean, this one's one of the rare ones where we've just got a big kookaburra there, so it's quite obvious where we are, but in a lot of them we do have to search a bit more for the Australiana coming through. But when we actually read the texts, rather than looking at the illustrations, and these were often written by her sister Annie or her husband Gregory, we do start to see a pervasive theme of conservation. So in Sarana the bush fairy, there she is, sitting with her little, they call them bears in the story, her little bear friend. The fairies are described as having made the bush, quote, beautiful in spite of all man's efforts to make it ugly and silent and desolate. But the destruction of the resources of the native environment, they're shown to drive the magic out of the bush. So the magic actually depends on the native environment. And, quote, soon the whole place echoed with the chop-chop of the axes, which made the great gums bow their heads and fall to the ground, never to stand up again. The ferny creeks cried in dismay, the flowers withered and died, the storms raged and the hot sun beat down. There was no more peace and shelter in the bush. Saddest of all was the cruel crack of the gun which the fairies would hear every now and then, because that meant they had lost another of their bird or animal friends. Unquote. Here, it's as if the bush has come alive and that the action of felling the trees is literally stripping the landscape of its life force, and that's shown through the magical creatures. Here, humans are the villains of the fairy tale, ever present and unwilling to cease in their actions. It's a powerful sentiment that comes through, but unfortunately it's not really supported by the illustrations. But yes, at least the bear is a little bit hopeful. Don't worry, he said. He's not random. So could we go to the next one? So humans are also represented as a source of waste, and this is enabled by their transformation of the environment. They're just leaving a lot of rubbish everywhere. This actually takes well into the 20th century to come forth, probably because we would have had a lot more of an urban population by then, and therefore the literature is starting to reflect that. So the Bird Parliament in Ethel English's Message of the Birds, in her 1926 text, Australian Fairy Tales, the sparrow remarks that he is, quote, keeping the streets tidy, telling all the lazy people that if they did some work, they would find energy, unquote. I'm not sure how work gives you energy, but we're looking at the sentiment of cleaning up after humans. So, in particular, May gives iconic gumnuts, Bib and Bob, feature in a comic strip. Next slide. And this was actually published posthumously, but it's all in the same spirit of it, and it is attributed to her. And Bob says, let's gather it all, almost, and send it back to him through the post. We found some rubbish and they're sending it back to the neighbour over the fence. And he said, it says, they made the parcel look nice and neat. Said Bib, he'll think it's something to eat. So, very, very cheeky little vein, but also, you know, an idea of having to clean up the waste that humans are just leaving everywhere. A merman in one of Ida Rental Uthwaite's books, The Little Fairy Sister, says that we keep the pools cleaned out, the rivers and streams free from rubbish so the water flows off to the sea. If we did not do this, the water would be choked up and rise and spread and flood the whole country and drown all those who live there. A little bit extreme, but again, same sentiment coming through. So here we've got several native and magical creatures taking it upon themselves to clean up the mess caused by the human occupation of the environment. It's a clear message to the readers, who at this point were probably increasingly second-generation settled Australians, that they need to do what they can to engage in minimising the waste that they leave. And here again we get fairy tales being used as a bit more of an educational tool, which is very common. Concern for animals in captivity is also another issue that's explored. Not just yet. Okay. No. Very close. Hold. So humans are shown to be cruel to animals with their use of cages. In Amy Mack's 1910 Waterside Stories, which I mentioned before, poor little Tommy Turtle. A kangaroo, again shown to be the voice of reason, perhaps because it's such a quintessentially Australian animal. He proclaims the concerns of the native animals. He says, no doubt it is bad enough to be shut up in a foreign land, but how would you like to be a prisoner in your own country? That is what I am. My fathers owned this land before any white humans came, and yet I'm captive here in my own country. Oh, it's a terrible thing that people who call themselves Australian should treat an Australian animal in such a way. So interestingly here we've got a double-edged criticism. One of the treatment of animals, and the other of the treatment of the Indigenous people, because we can see the kangaroo as being a metaphor or a symbol for them. And let's go to the next slide. Quite a lot of May Gibbs' work is dedicated to defending animals in captivity. So I don't know if you can see this properly. It's an image from one of her stories called Nutterbub and Knittersing. Bit of a mouthful, I kept typing it wrong. And I don't know if you can see it, but they are picketing, and the little pickets say, "Help our animals, down with humans, they set traps, and cages are so cruel." So it's pretty cute actually. But in this story, the government town actually makes a law punishing anyone who's cruel to animals, so there is a kind of retribution aspect to it. And in Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, the different story that they're featured in, they are warned that humans will kill you or shut you up until you die. And that really sums up how the native population and flora and fauna are sort of being treated. Cuddlepie sums up the plight of animals in a nutshell, or should I say gumnut? Thank you. I've been working on that one. He says, just because we are little doesn't mean means they think we can't feel. And I think he sums that up quite nicely. And that's just when they've seen one of their poor little deer possum friends be captured. So again and again, the native creatures in these fairy tales are captured by humans and cruelly treated. Mrs. Koala, who's Blinky Bill's mum, pleads with Splodge the kangaroo to take us far, far away from them, the humans. Take us back to our old home. Take us away from men and zoos. There's a clear running concern over the treatment of animals, and by using children's books to highlight this, there's a hope that the young readers might act differently. So through these examples, we can see that humans in Australia of all backgrounds aren't well received by the native animal population. And overall, the story stands as a critique of urbanisation because of the central population taking over so much of the natural environment, treating the animals poorly and leaving them to pick up their waste. Next one. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is how these stories represent concerns about natural disasters and the Australian climate in general, being such a quite unique climate in itself. So unlike many other countries, or similarly in some ways to other countries, the Australian climate is quite fierce, and it's often a deadly environment that poses threats to both the animal and human population alike. And as we'll see, it poses a threat to the fairy population too. So Australia's lack of water and subsequent drought is a key concern in Australian fairy tales. In the 1920s, the fairy Prince Waratah finds a magical well that quenches the thirst of the local flora and fauna. And whilst this example is really more of a thinly veiled campaign to support the colonisation of Australia, a fairy prince building a city in the middle of Australia and stamping his name all over it. When you look at the picture, it's clearly a European city, so it's not even subtle. But it does highlight the reality of having to live in such an extreme environment, that water is precious and it's something that is hard to come by, and that drought really has quite a large effect on the population. In Savannah, the bush fairy, as I mentioned previously, she laments the destruction of the environment by the felling of trees, and she also meets the spirit of the waterfall. So the spirit of the waterfall tells her that my father's enemy, a very cruel and wicked spirit, whose name is Drought, is always going about scorching the green and fruitful land and drying up the creeks as he goes. However, my father Rain always catches up to him, and my uncle, whose name is Flood. He doesn't mean to be unkind, but there is such a thing as being too kind, you know, so kind that it becomes cruelty. So interestingly here, the natural elements of drought, rain and flood, they're magical spirits. So to the overseas market, the extremity of the Australian culture would have seemed quite otherworldly. And in fact, throughout many Australian fairy tales, the native environment is portrayed as only existing within the realm of fairyland. It's like it's not even real. But it's just being shown as different to Europe again. But I can talk about that another day. So, I just want you to have a look at this illustration. I don't know if you can see it particularly well. I did blow it up as big as I can manage. This is a picture from May Gibbs' story, Scotty in Gumnut Land, which follows a little Scotty dog who goes into Gumnut Land and accidentally brings upon the town a big flood. So you can see there's a Banksia man hanging off a tree, there's a cow on a roof, and there's a little rabbit in an umbrella, so it's all happening, and poor little creatures are trying to survive. But in this story, May Gibbs opens one of the sections with the following observation. The burden of the drought lay heavily upon the creatures in Governor Town. There were stern water restrictions. Notices pasted on the walls in the town said, "Creatures, save the water. Creatures, take care of the drips. The gallons will take care of themselves. Creatures, bathe one half one day and one half the next. Creatures, wear your clothes first one side and then the other. Creatures, use dry shampoo." Each day, over the air, a loud voice warned all the creatures to beware. Terrible punishment will fall upon those who waste water or break the rules of the water board. So, May Gibbs here, she had quite an international appeal. So her concern over Australia's water usage is highlighted on both a local and an international level, and we really get the kind of extremity of the climate, because from one minute we've got drought and then the next minute we've got extreme flooding, and there's somebody's washing is now floating in the water at the bottom, and it's complete devastation. So through these examples we can see a kind of running commentary and concern about drought and other threats to the environment. Again, the tales are being used in such a way not only just to highlight the environmental issues, but also to campaign in favour of the local flora and fauna, encouraging both child and adult readers alike in an educational way. Next slide. So I'm just going to finish off having a chat about any conclusions. So we've seen in Australian fairy tales that we get the destruction of the natural environment from the settled population coming in. We get concerns about the treatment of animals. We get concerns about the waste that humanity is leaving, and the need to have an awareness and care in times of flooding and drought and the extreme climate that we all have to live with. So when we look at these stories and look at the time frame, they're happening roughly from the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. So, and the amount of environmental concern really just snowballs as you go on in time. But the question is why? So what I have concluded is that one of the main reasons for the rise in environmentalism during the late 19th and well into the 20th century is a growing sense of nationhood and Australian identity that was starting to be cemented at the time. So whilst home as a reference could mean England well into the 20th century, an increased identification of the landscape as a part of national identity would have resulted in the production of texts that promoted environmental conservation. So fairy tales, often so marketed for children, though I acknowledge that this hasn't been and isn't always the case, since the Grimms have been really used as educational tools. So here, the fairy tales coming out of the rise in nationalism seek to educate younger audiences in the importance of environmental conservation. So as a key example, Foster, Finnis and Nimmin, all well-respected children's literature academics, they describe May Gibbs, taking her as a bit of a case study, as enunciating in terms even the youngest audience can comprehend how intrinsically valuable and fascinating the Australian bush is. She's sharing her appreciation of the natural world, as well as suggesting that there's an obligation to care for it. So Gibbs' work stands as a wider example of Australian fairy tales being used as a vehicle for encouraging environmental conservation. In fact, whilst many of her characters do lament the destruction of the environment by humans, as we saw with poor old Cuddle Pie. I was going to mix them around. I was going Cuddle Pot. You know, lamenting the destruction that humans bring, that they're going to just take us and kill us. They refer to humanity as monsters. But also in the stories, we do see a human actually open up the trap and release a possum back into the wild, if you like. So humanity is shown to have the potential to show kindness to native creatures too. So it's not all bad. There is some sort of redeeming features that we do have, thank goodness. So in examining the representation of the environment in Australian fairy tales, we're able to engage in an area of emerging literary theory called eco-criticism. Perhaps obviously it's a theoretical framework that looks at literature and the environment. So it's an interdisciplinary field, and it has Australia fits into this in terms of the debates and the interpretations that have cropped up. There's a professor at AU called Lily Robin, and she's arguing that Australia's sort of historical situation makes it unique, that it doesn't quite fit into the transcendental romantic wilderness view, which is the American canon, nor the pastoral romantic British genre. We don't quite fit into either. So an eco-critical examination of the text they're a little problematic. But despite this, we can look at the fairy tales that I've mentioned in terms of how they portray the natural environment and the concerns that are represented. So there's Professor of Sociology, Robert J. Bruhl, and he says that questions about the preservation of the natural environment are not just technical questions. They're also about what defines the good and moral life, and about the essence and the meaning of our existence. Hence, these are not just academic or technical matters to be settled in elite dialogues between experts. These are fundamental questions of defining what our human community is and how it should exist. So our relationship with the environment portrays how we relate to each other and how it forms a large part of our identity as a society. So for example, to take from one of the tales that I've mentioned, when we look at the environment as wild, it's shown to be outside of human control. And for example, Dot in Pedley's tale, she is constantly saying that the bush is cruel and wild and it makes her feel as though she's in a prison. So the environment here is outside of human control, and it makes us uncomfortable when it's outside of human control. So if her experience of the bush is in relation to her ability to feel in control, then we get quite an anthropocentric or human-focused representation of the natural, which opens the fairy tale up for further discussion. So eco-criticism is, excuse the term and phrase, a natural progression when looking at environmentalism in fairy tales, especially Australian fairy tales, and certainly a work in progress on my part. But in light of global warming and other environmental issues, I think it is good to look back at these tales for the concerns that they had and the relevance that they do have today. A lot of these issues, they haven't changed. They're still, especially things like drought, very much affecting our environment at the moment. So finally, just go to the next one. I'd like to leave you with a lovely image from the inside cover from The Complete Adventures of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, published in 1947. It says, "Humans, please be kind to all bush creatures and don't pull flowers up by the roots." A sentiment that I think sums up the environmental concern quite nicely. So that's all. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful presentation from our new treasurer, Catherine. That was actually Catherine's first academic paper, and I think she did exceptionally